Hey guys, it's Tim here. Today's going to be a fun one. I am on my way to a 50-person wedding in a small backyard, so it's a work day for me. And I wanted to stop by the camera store and pick up a lens on my way. So I'm stopping at Henry's Camera in downtown. So let's hop in. Someone's got a lens for me.
Yeah, she should be back from break momentarily. If
What lens?
It was a 16mm.
Yeah, it's a side. I can help you out in 1 second.
All right, thanks. Perfect.
For Tim, right?
Yeah, it was, yeah. You don't mind me filming, do you?
No, it's okay. What are you filming?
Well, I'm diversifying my income, so I'm trying to build a YouTube channel.
Cool.
And also, I find it helps me get me new clients too, so it's
Yeah, absolutely.
it doesn't do too bad.
Going from somewhere, by the way?
I'm going somewhere.
Going somewhere.
Yeah, I didn't realize the card machine was waiting for me.
Oh, no, it's okay. So where are you going to?
I'm popping in because my widest is 24.
Okay.
And I'm going to a 50-person wedding in a small back garden.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I kind of need something wider, you know, I don't... All right, I got myself a nice cheap little lens there. That will help for today's wedding. And I'll see you all guys very soon. Hey everybody, it's Tim, a wedding and lifestyle photographer based out of Eastern Ontario. And today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I picked up some RF glass. Shocker, fuck. Sorry, bad language. As you can see, on my way to a recent wedding, I needed something a little bit different. So let's check out this 16mm f2.8 STM lens by Canon. It's RF glass. My first impressions, it's itty bitty. It's super light. Like I couldn't even tell that I had this in my bag. And I have some pretty heavy gear, which is probably why I can't tell. But it also is kind of cheap. Like, I mean, that's the lens cap, but it does feel kind of cheap. You know, I nearly lost the lens cap. Like it's, if you haven't seen my normal lens caps, they're normally like 82mm. This thing is really small at 43mm. Look at how small that front element is. So, first impressions, it's small, it's light, focus is noisy, but I had fun with it. So why use this lens at a wedding? And this lens does have a place. However, there are other options that you could consider. But let's get into that just a little bit down the road. So where this lens fits in. I had a wedding coming up. And like, I don't often go downtown. I had a wedding coming up. It was a 50-guest wedding in a small backyard in downtown Ottawa. This yard is pretty small. And I had a feeling, and I'm like thinking in my gut, and I'm like, my widest focal length is a 24. I'm like, I have a feeling that that is not going to be enough. So off I go, and I'm thinking a couple of days ahead of time, I'm like, you know, I don't have it in my budget right now to get the 16-35 EF mount lens. And I don't have it also, you know, and also like, I also, you know, I do like the, I believe it's the 14-24, the Sigma 2.8. However, that leaves like a practicality stat, you know, the 14-24 isn't practical. It's a fantabulous lens, but it's not practical for weddings. And I'll get into that in a little bit. And also, like, I didn't have it in my budget to get the 15-35, the RF 2.8 lens. So I'm thinking up like a week before this wedding that's coming up. And I'm going, what can I use instead? And I'm looking at other people's reviews and I'm checking this thing out. And I'm like, because I always prefer weather sealed glass, and all my lenses that I use for a work day have the gasket on the back and they have the weather sealing, excluding the 85, which has the gasket but no weather sealing on the rest of it, which is kind of bizarre, but okay, whatever. So I'm like, okay, you know, I'll check out some reviews. And does this lens have a place at a wedding? And it does have a place, especially in small areas with a lot going on. So, small backyard wedding, 50 guests. I want to be able to get some of the ambience in, and a 24 would not have been enough. I would have walked away from that wedding disappointed. Now, granted, I used this lens for setting the scene, getting a wide angle shot of the ceremony location. And I used it for some occasional candids as well. I didn't use it for detail shots because I use a macro for that. The 16mm for a wedding is a fun focal length to use. And I had a lot of fun using it at a wedding. Now, I didn't use it a lot, but it was nice to have that option. And it will really make my client's gallery really set the tone for their wedding. And I am, for the money that I paid, I'm very happy for it. Okay, so let's get into some strengths and weaknesses of this lens. Strengths. It is small and it's light. So if you're not doing wide angle shots that often, like me, however, I wouldn't mind, actually, this is a secret, shh. Now that I've had the 16mm, but if you're only doing occasional wide shots, this lens is good because you're not spending $3-something thousand just to get the 16mm. So a good strength of this lens is that it's cheap. It is also light. It is compact, so it doesn't take up much space in your bag at all. You know, small lens, pro body. Woo. Anyways, this lens is cheap and cheerful. Like, it's not weather sealed. So, strengths. It is small, it's compact, it's light, it's cheap. It cost me $400 before taxes, Canadian. That's easy to swallow. Like, I mean, I'm happy spending that just for, you know, I checked online at Henry's Camera before I went down because I'm like, I should get something wider than a 24. And I'm like, you know, I don't do wide that often. So I'm like, you know, I don't want to spend $3 for something that I'm not sure if I want yet. So $400, I'm happy with that. I live with that. Go grab it. For the results that you get for the price, I'm happy. Is it flawed? Yes. But am I still happy? Yeah. Now, obviously, some people might complain that it's not an L series lens and it's not going to get L series results. But, you know, the results are good enough. You know, quite often some of these shots, you know, if it goes into a wedding album, they're not going to be able to see. A wedding album is not the size of a wall. So they're not going to see as, you know, as some of the flaws that we can see on a monitor. The flaws kind of almost make this lens a little bit, you know, it does suffer with severe, so let's get into the cons. It does suffer with some pretty heavy chromatic aberration, and we're going to jump into some pictures soon. Cons, it's not weather sealed, so if you're out in the bad weather and you have a weather sealed body like I do, I have 2 of these, and we stick one of these on it, and it rains. Guess what? Water can get in here and then into your camera. So you now have an entry point on your camera that can let moisture and water inside, killing your expensive camera. That is a con. Again, another con, severe chromatic aberration. And and the use of digital optimization. Now, I will jump into that in a little while, and we're going to have a look. Another con is I feel like I'm going to break this lens. I'm not rough on my gear by any stretch, but I have a feeling that this lens won't last as long as my professional grade equipment. But you know, what's $400? If I drop it and break it, I'm not claiming it on insurance. I'm just going to go and buy another one. Now, another con is that it's not the 15-35. So if you're using this for weddings and you have an 85mm on your other body and you're using this, it's not going to pair too well. What would pair really well on a work day is if you're in an area that needs a wide angle, but you're also doing candids where you don't want distortion. So I normally shoot at the 35mm focal length on my 24-70, or my 40 or a 40mm focal length on my 40mm 1.4 prime. And on my other body, if I'm not in the ceremony, I will use an 85 1.4 prime. So the 35mm and the 85mm, they pair extremely well together whilst you're working, because you get an environmental portrait focal length and you have a headshot close up, or half body from further away focal length. So that's where a 16-35mm lens or the 15-35mm RF lens would go extremely well with an 85, because you can do the environmental portrait. And then if you're in an environment that needs a wide angle of 16 or 15mm, like in a small, backyard wedding where there's a lot of guests, that lens is where it's going to work really, really well. And that is why I wouldn't recommend, as much as I love the 14-24, the Sigma 2.8 lens, it doesn't go to 35. And that's where it's probably the only Sigma lens that I probably wouldn't buy for my work. But if you're on a budget, this lens is going to work very well for getting those wide angles when you can't afford the 15-35mm focal length. It's going to work very well. And you're going to be happy with the results too. I'm putting asterisks because I have a couple more cons too, but that's with any general wide angle length lens. Once you get wider, even when you're using the shallower apertures, you're not going to be blowing out the backgrounds as much. Like, it's not going to be an 85 shooting at 2.8. Let me give you that. A 16 at 2.8 and a 35, so you have the zoom lens. But if you're using the 16 and you're shooting at 2.8, your backgrounds aren't going to be creamy or blurry at all. But they're still, they'll be out of focus a little bit. But, if you're expecting the creamy background, you're not going to get this with this lens. Another thing is that once you start shooting close to people, their faces and bodies will become distorted and it won't look as natural. However, I find this lens does a pretty good job when you remove some of the optical stabilization in post-processing. So there's that too. And let's jump into some pictures on my computer. We'll have a look and I'll show you a couple of images that I took over the last wedding I shot with this. All right, now that we're done with that, let's jump into Lightroom and have a look at some of the images that this lens produces. Now, when you first bring in the image into Lightroom, it kind of looks like this. Now, I always have my images come in with lens distortion corrections applied to the image. And then I can make any adjustments I want afterwards. So here's a before shot. Let's have a look. Now the corners, because I do underexpose my images just a little bit to protect the highlights, there is not that much color fringing in this particular image. However, you know, it is soft in places, especially when you get around the corners. You know, it's not sharp. However, I do vignette my corners to compensate for that with all my images. That's kind of my look. You know, in this corner, you know, those chairs are kind of okay sharp. This image was taken at 2.8, so going back to one of the disadvantages and advantages from earlier, that even though, you know, shooting at 2.8, you do not get really any separation at all. Everything is almost kind of in focus. See, the chairs are in focus. Everyone's, you know, pretty in focus. But also that brings it to an advantage because it is only equipped with an STM lens. It means focusing on this lens is pretty quick and it's pretty snappy, and I was, you know, pleasantly surprised by it. So this is the edit that I have actually done myself, and as you can see, the distortion I have changed. So bringing it into Lightroom, bear in mind this is just a quick edit. I haven't done any edits to the skies. You know, I've lightened the image, so, and I've also applied some chromatic aberration correction. See this one, you can see a little bit of purple fringing up in the corner there, and without this profile correction. So this is the image without the profile corrections. Now, as you can see, it is pretty heavily vignetted. You are going to be pulling a lot out the shadows. So the shadow, you know, the corners could get fairly grainy, especially in darker environments. As you see, you pull it up there, you know, there is a loss of sharpness, you know, pretty soft around the corners, but, you know, I'm not surprised that it isn't sharp in the corners because, you know, $400 lens. Now, as you can see, I have actually pulled back on the distortion correction. So when I first brought it into Lightroom, it was underneath the Adobe Canon RF version 2, which was like that. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? I don't remember seeing that in the camera. It wasn't like that. So let's put it to the version 1, or the one that doesn't say v.2, and it kind of seems more like that. You know, it has some profile corrections, but it's a wider shot. This is more of what I can remember. As you can see, you know, it's almost like a mustache, the distortion. Almost like a mustache, you know, but whatever. And then I pulled it back. And I'm like, because, you know, it brings out the chairs, you know, it stretches items. And I'm like, you know, it's a wide angle lens. It's supposed to look wide. So, you know, I pulled it back and I pulled it back. And I'm like, this is what it would look like uncorrected. And I still have the vignetting, you know, I've left that at 100 because I also reapply vignetting to an image, which would be underneath here, I believe. So, yeah. So that's with my vignetting turned off. And that's with my own vignetting turned back on. So as you can see, I do apply some of my own vignetting. So this would be the lens correction 100 vignetting. And, you know, I actually prefer the look of it this way than at 100. And especially then the version 2. Because the version 2, like, you lose some of that focal length. What is the correct 16mm focal length? That's kind of hard to say with these two versions, but I'm guessing the first one. I think that's what you're supposed to be getting within the camera, because that looks more similar to what I actually saw on the day. So don't be disappointed when you first bring it into Lightroom if it's under the version 2 and you're like, that doesn't seem right. You know, it's still a wide shot, but like, it's not as wide as I remember taking it on that day. So I brought it to, so that's my edit there. You know, I turned the distortion all the way off. You know, I enabled the profile corrections just I kept the vignetting and I reduced the distortion all the way, because you know what? I like it. I like it like that. Maybe it has a bit of an M mustache, you know, bit of a weird distortion to it, but I kind of like that super wide look. So I'm probably getting maybe just a touch more than the 16. But, you know, let's hop along to the next image, and you will see which image has a lot. So this one here, there's another one with the profile corrections. I didn't have to apply extra manual defringe, like color aberration correction, chromatic aberration correction. So again, with this one, I changed it from V2 to version 2 Adobe correction back to the original one. So as you see, at number 2, there is a big difference between what you were getting. Oops. So again, 16mm, and then I turn off the distortion. Because even though, because I find with the distortion, you know, applied, it really stretches a lot of the image, and you know that's kind of where, you know, like a lot of wide angles will. But I just find that turning it off produces a much more natural look. So there is that. Let's go back to my edit, you know, and this is how it would look when I first brought it in. This would be underneath the version 2, V.2, you know, correction applied. So as you can see, there is a big difference. And let's go to the unedited images up in the corners. Can you see the chromatic aberration now? No. Here we go. Can we see it in this image? There was one particular image where there was a lot of chromatic aberration. Can we? Yeah, as you can see here up in the corners, you can start to see purple. There was one image in particular. Now I haven't finished working on these images, like I could lighten the shadows. So let's apply a mask up here like that. You know, bring some warmth into that, I think. Make it kind of summery. Yeah. Just a quick adjustment there. But as you can see, like, even though there is some softening, it does keep a lot of the details, and I find it's much better than what the cheapy lenses used to be back in the mid-2000s. Now here we go, is another group shot. I use this as like a storyteller type image to set the scene of the guests arriving. As you see, it's done a good job. Again, with the distortion, you know, I've applied some manual defringing to the image, because I believe it had some, you can still see with like some adjustment that there is still some fringing up in the corners. It does have a lot more chromatic aberration and purple fringing than what I've seen on reviews for the Canon 15-35 RF lens. So can I turn that off? It's going to change the whole image again because I've moved distortion, but you can see a little bit of purple fringing there. But essentially here we go to the profile correction again, and if we go to the version 2 and then turn off the distortion, we're on version 2, yeah. So this is what it looked like becoming, you know, that it was imported into Lightroom. You're losing a lot of the image with that version 2 profile correction. So I'm like, this is weird. So I stick it to version 1, and you bring back a little bit more of the image. And I believe that's what the 16mm is supposed to be. However, when you remove that distortion, like with the profile correction on, you get a lot of stretching here of the people, because I'm pretty close, and that's to be expected. However, when you turn it off, I feel like they become more natural looking. they don't seem, as stretched. And it's handled this guy's shirts, even though he's not in the bright light, it has handled it reasonably well. Looks like there is some color. I am at 100% right now, so let's zoom into 200. Yeah, as you can see, I mean, we're getting close to the edges, and, it's not sharp. But, look, see, there we go. We can see some purple chromatic aberration. And I have already applied some. Now, if you were to print this into a wedding album in a book, you're not going to see that. Unless you're looking at it really close. And, there's some chromatic aberration on this gentleman's shirt. And we go with some green chromatic aberration. But all in all, I am pretty pleased for the few images that I will deliver to the client's gallery of these files. They're good enough. I'd say, I'm happy. I had fun using it. What's the most important part, even though this lens has faults, and yes, it's not as good as the 15-35, and the 15-35 is, it's on my list of lenses to get for the RF mount. It does help with the storytelling for my line of work. And I believe that this lens does add value to my work because, with the 24, I wouldn't have got this entire image of all the guests here interacting. And I was fairly close, and it was a small space, like I was backed up against a bush taking this one image. I am happy with the $400 that I spent on it. And for $400, I am happy with the result. Pretty more than happy. Yes, it has its faults. But, it's adequate. I've done a basic edit on this job, and this one too. Like here, there's the original file that comes in on the version 2 import. And I believe it does add depth. I wouldn't have captured this entire shot on a 24. I believe it helps exceedingly with the storytelling part of the day. And this 16mm, it has earned a place in my bag. That's for sure. One thing to remember is if I don't use it that often, which I have a feeling I might actually use this pretty often, is I have to remember which profile to bring it on, because it's going to come in looking like that. And you're going to have to change it to version 1. And you're going to have to change it to version 1. And, it's up to you whether or not you remove the distortion correction. But I find having the distortion turned off, I think it makes a rather cool image. Yeah, there's distortion, but I think that's what makes it cool. And that's probably something that I do with other lenses too, where they're super wide like that. If you're after a super wide image, I'm not doing, these pictures aren't for architectural use. They're for telling a story, Maybe if I was taking pictures of a house and I wanted all the lines straight, sure, I'd leave it on version 1 and you have nice straight lines and, you're taking a picture of a house and all the lines are straight. But for taking pictures of people, I think that people look a lot more flattering with the distortion turned off. That's just my personal opinion. So, who is this lens for? Well, if you're just expanding your kit and you're looking to get into wide focal lengths, so if you have a couple of kit zooms, or you have the 28, 70, 2.8, or a 50 1.8, the 35 1.8, and you're looking to explore wide angles, this is going to be your option to do it on a good, a cheap budget, $400 Canadian. If you're a wedding photographer and you're just breaking out into using wide angles, I've had wide angles before, just not in a long time. This is going to be a great entry into that, just like I've used. I don't have the, I'm not in the budget right now for the RF 15 to 35. The Sigma version up to, the 14 to 24. It's not, however, it is cheaper. It's very heavy, and also it doesn't go to 35. So that I find, because it doesn't go to 35, it rules it out for use on a wedding day. The EF version, the 16 to 35, that's still going to be a great option, but again, it's still a very expensive option. It's, even still on the used market. So if you want to get into using wide angle focal lengths, and you don't use wide angles that often, not often enough to justify getting, spending $3,000+ on a lens, this is going to be a superb option. It doesn't break the bank. And, to use it on a wedding day to help story tell, I am going to be pulling this lens out, I think, fairly often, because it does help with setting the scene, and, it's a storytelling focal length. I believe with the distortion correction turned off, it produces wonderful images that help tell the day. And it's, you're only going to be using this lens to deliver maybe 1 or 2 pictures to the client's gallery. It's going to be a filler focal length to help fill in some of the story. It's not a main focal length. So in your bag as a wedding photographer, yes. If you're just expanding your kit from kit lenses, yes. If you have professional lenses, but you're not into the super wide and you want to test it out, yes, I would get it. If you're doing like architectural, you might struggle with straight lines. Give it a bash. For $400, it's not going to hurt, right? If it's not for you, then it won't hurt. $400. Where I wouldn't, because of the chromatic aberration, especially in the corners and on bright colors, I don't think this is going to be a good lens for astrophotography, because there's going to be too much color fringing. Now, maybe I'll test that out in another video, but, I've only done, astrophotography is, it's not a jam of mine. I've done it, captured the northern lights, but it's not something that I go out and do all the time. Weddings is what I do. So I can talk mainly from that perspective. So that's my experience with shooting with the 16mm f2.8 at its first backyard wedding. As you can see, it has earned a spot in my bag, especially for the value of this lens offers. I can provide those, filler shots to help tell the story and set the scene of a wedding. I really appreciate it if you give me a like, comment, and subscribe. I love to see you guys follow the channel and see where it takes us. Thank you guys. Have a great one.